Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with David Frum for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll cover an extraordinary past several days in the world of politics, including the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump, the kickoff of the Republican Party's national convention in Milwaukee, and Trump's selection of JD Vance as his vice presidential candidate. David, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a heavy week.
Indeed. Let's start with the assassination attempt on President Trump. You wrote a much circulated response in The Atlantic over the weekend that I'd strongly encourage listeners and viewers to read. How have you chosen to interpret this event, and what does it tell us about American politics?
Well, many have said there's no place for violence in American politics, and how I wish that were a true statement, but it is sadly not a true statement. American politics is endemic, soaked in violence. Long histories of rioting and racial pogroms, many assassination attempts against presidents, presidential candidates, other important figures. It's a country with a lot of disgruntled individuals and a lot of weapons, and police forces that aren't always up to the job. And that's what seems to be happening in this terrible case. This person looks like to have had not a strong political agenda, what we know about him, but to have been deranged or unhappy in some way and unstable, and to have expressed himself by this terrible act on the life of Donald Trump.
I want to pivot, David, because we could speculate about the assassination attempt for some time, and yet, as you say, we're still only learning more about this individual and the motives and speculating about the consequences and the fallout. But I want to turn to the start of the Republican convention. Why don't you situate the convention for our Canadian audience? Ostensibly, you've attended them in the past. What are their significance in terms of the presidential cycle? And how should we think about this year's particular Republican convention in the lead up to November's presidential election?
Well, I attended the 2016 convention in Cleveland that nominated Donald Trump the first time, and I scored one sweet room because no one of the traditional backers of the Republican Party wanted to go. There are cancellations, and so I got a call from someone I knew, like, would you like a suite in a hotel right in the center of town? And at past conventions, you're 45-minute taxi. If you're in the press, you're in the 45-minute taxi range. I mean, you're in the next town over, in the next state over. But it was a convention where the people would traditionally back the Republican Party wanted nothing to do with it. They thought that Donald Trump was a weirdo. They thought they didn't like his views on trade and immigration. And they also thought he was a certain loser. And they didn't see any need to write big checks for parties. So there are very few parties compared to other conventions. It was quite a small scale show. 8 years later, there is no doubt that there's been a total fusion of the Trump movement and the Republican Party. Whereas it used to be the Trump movement was sort of an alien presence inside the Republican Party, an uneasy cohabitation with it. Now they're all in. Trump has moved toward the Republicans. There's no more suggestion that he's got an economic agenda for lower income people. This is an upper income person's party. It's all about the corporate tax cuts and spending cuts. At the same time, the party has moved to him on trade protection. And the party has especially moved to him on a de facto amnesty for his attempt to overthrow the 2020 election. That is not to be talked of. And in light of the terrible assassination attempt on him, there has been a widespread feeling we need to cool the overheated rhetoric. And that's been interpreted by Republicans to mean no more criticizing what we did on January 6th of 2021.
Let me ask another peculiar manifestation of that fusion. Last night, the party had an online pornographer who apparently makes $1 million a month speak at the convention. Now, David, I'm not a prude, but this isn't the conservative politics I grew up with. What's happened to the values wing of the Republican Party? Why would they put up with something like that?
Well, look, once you've nominated Donald Trump, it seems kind of squeamish to draw the line at a mere pornographer. Like, you're all in. This is now this is the party for whoremongers and whores. This is the Roger Stone, Donald Trump Republican Party. This is the party of money and satchels and 3-inch steaks and strippers. I think it makes perfect sense, and I think it's consistent. The value. I think what we've also seen is just how cheap a date the values wing of the party always was, and they never got much, and now they get less.
Let me digress for 1 second because I think it may be relevant to the rest of our conversation. I want to ask you about the recent British election and the possible lessons that one can derive for US and Canadian conservatives. David, one interpretation of the outcome is that populists are now such a meaningful portion of the center-right coalition that the conservatives' failure to be responsive to them caused these voters to flee to Nigel Farage's Reform Party, and that in turn led to their defeat. What do you think of that line of analysis? Is it a sign that, for better or for worse, center-right parties need to reconcile themselves to a degree of populism?
I think the British case is quite individual and very different from what's going on in Canada and the United States. The core of what happened, in my opinion, in British politics, or to the British conservatives, was to appease a wing of the party that was more radical. The leadership promised a referendum on Brexit. Brexit won. The conservatives then bet the party and the country on Brexit working out. And instead, Brexit proved to be a generational disaster. And the British conservatives then split. Those who don't want to acknowledge that it was a disaster, those who insist that more and better and faster Brexit would have had better results, they are committed to Nigel Farage and his reform movement. And the rest of the conservative world just is beaten because that was their big project. That is the most important thing that the Cameron conservatives and then all the other leaders after him had did in a decade in power. They took the Britain out of the European Union, and when it doesn't work, you have to pay the political price. And I imagine what happens now in British politics is the new government finds some way to redress the worst harms of Brexit, find some way to reopen the borders with Europe, allow goods and services to flow more freely than they are flowing right now, gets British growth up, moving again. When you take down those barriers to trade and goods and services, Britain, I think, will resume growing. They have everything going. They have an educated population. They have great geography. They have all the attributes of a fully advanced country. But they made this one terrible policy decision, and then the conservatives will split, in maybe in more formal ways, over those who understand you have to trade with your neighbors, and you're going to trade more with your neighbors than you're going to trade with anybody else. That's just geography. And you're going to trade that Britain will trade more with France than with Australia, even though the Australians speak English and the French don't. That's just the way it's going to be. And as they make their peace with that, the way to a comeback for conservatives will be over because Labor will spend too much and regulate too much and do all the things that Labor governments do that make them unpopular in their turn.
Thanks for permitting me that digression, David. I thought it might be useful context for a conversation about the Republican convention in general and JD Vance's nomination as Donald Trump's vice presidential candidate in particular. Let me put it to you directly. Does Vance's nomination help or hinder the Trump campaign in November? And what do you think of the argument that he was selected less for his electoral contribution and more that he can help a second Trump administration deliver on the president's populist agenda?
Well, I have a darker theory of why he was selected. JD Vance is one of the most outspoken opponents of supporting Ukraine in the U.S. Senate. And the other opponents like Rand Paul are not very effective senators, and he's a more effective senator. So he may be the most important voice of the anti-Ukraine wing. And there are some very big money people in the Republican world who also share that anti-Ukraine philosophy. And I just think what happened was that, and Trump shares it too, of course. And so that issue, which is much more important to Trump than he lets on right now, plus the money of the anti-Ukraine billionaires, I think that was decisive. Elon Musk made a $45 million contribution to Donald Trump in the past few weeks. I smell some kind of, maybe not a transaction, but an understanding. Will it help or will it hurt? Vice presidential nominees very, very seldom do either. The experts tell us that the selection of Lyndon Johnson probably helped John F. Kennedy in 1960, and the selection of Sarah Palin maybe hurt John McCain in 2008. And those are the outlier cases. Usually most people won't know anything about the vice president, won't have views. In this case, though, Trump missed the opportunity for something that might help, that he could have picked somebody who reassured soft Republicans. And whereas JD Vance, he is a super protectionist, he's anti-Ukraine. He claims that although he's skeptical about helping Ukraine and helping Taiwan, he's not skeptical of Israel. And some of the Jewish Republicans believe this. I don't believe the human mind can work that way, that you can make some sense of. We break faith with most of our friends, but we keep faith with Israel. The kind of person who wants to break faith with Ukraine tends not to be hugely enthusiastic about Israel most of the time. And as I mentioned, he's a big protectionist, and locks that in. And he's also a phony baloney on the whole help working class issue. He has been one of the leading forces in the United States Senate for deregulating the cryptocurrency industry, which preys on and exploits mercilessly exactly the people that JD Vance said he went into politics to help. Cryptocurrency is unfortunately very attractive to people with limited financial knowledge, limited financial resources, and especially people with high risk tolerances, i.e., struggling young men. That's who just cryptocurrency disproportionately preys upon minority groups, again, because lack of financial sophistication and tolerance for risk and distrust in institutions. And so people ought to be putting away whatever they can in a safe and secure retirement fund are gambling on cryptocurrency. The Securities and Exchange Commission has tried to put some brakes on this gambling, and JD Vance has been the enemy because his friends in Silicon Valley are among the predators.
It seems to me that one way to think about Vance's VP nomination is to juxtapose him with Paul Ryan, the party's 2012 VP nominee. What does the shift from Ryan to Vance signal? And to what extent, David, are Ryan and others somewhat responsible for these developments? In other words, how much responsibility for this transformation of the Republican Party lies with those who led it in the preceding years?
Yeah. Look, ideologically, there are a lot of differences between Ryan and Vance, but there's one way that they're very similar, which is Republican tickets have a difficult time saying, you know what, maybe we need to put a little water in our wine. Maybe we need to reach out to different kinds. Mitt Romney was already seen by the voters he needed as a representative of all that was wealthy and powerful in American society. And although that wasn't quite fair, and although, as we've seen, Mitt Romney was he's demonstrated to the whole world what a man of character and independence he was. In the way he looked in 2012, he was seen as just the voice of wealth. So you don't say, why don't we get two of those? One even more radical, one younger and more radical. That he could have had somebody who softened the image, who reached to, and the same way with Donald Trump. I mean, if Donald Trump were a completely different person and the movement that behind him were a completely different movement, you might say this might be a moment to sort of bridge our differences, and if Aaron Sorkin is making the movie, you pick somebody who's on the other side of January 6th, and Trump gives a speech about the lessons he learned and how he let his emotions run away with him, and he'll never do that again. I mean, that's obviously a different human being, but the idea that the answer is always, voters don't want ham and eggs, give them double ham and double eggs, which is a chronic vice of people in politics, true believers in politics. But it's especially, the Republicans say, triple ham, triple eggs, never relent, never reach out. And Trump is gambling with Vance that he can get his 46% of the country so excited that it will make up for the fact that it is only 46%. And I suppose they're hoping that Biden so deflates his potential 53% that it shrinks.
What does Vance's selection tell us, if anything, David, about a possible second term? And as you think about your answer, why don't you reflect on the possible implications, in particular for Canada?
Look, for Canada, the implications are pretty grim because both parties are now more protectionist than either party has ever been before. If Donald Trump was the most protectionist president since 1945, or since really the Great Depression, then Joe Biden was the second most. And Vance will be an accelerant on Trump's own strong protectionism. And there isn't going to be a lot of restraint in Congress, even if if Trump wins and the Democrat and the country does not spiral into chaos, and then the Democrats, there's a reasonably normal and free election in 2026, and there's not going to be a break on that, because the Democratic Congressional Party is not going to say we need to trade freely with anybody, not even never even with our friends, never mind the rest of the world. So that's a thing really to worry about. And I think there is a danger that if Canada is a conservative government, that some in the conservative world will think that personal relationships can offset ideological and congressional realities, and they really don't. There's just too much at stake. That the way Canada is going to have to deal with whoever is the next government, and fortunately, Canadian embassies in Washington have understood this, is by making very specific alliances, especially at the state level, with governors and states that have the wisdom to understand what a disaster for them and for the world American protectionism is.
One subject that we've talked a lot about over the course of these conversations, David, for the past couple of years, has been about the center of gravity of Anglo-American conservatism and its future. What has the past week or so signaled about those two fundamental areas of interest for the Hub and a lot of its viewers and listeners?
Well, it signals those of us who continue to believe in the post-war world, in the arrangements and institutions that brought so much prosperity, so much security to so many people in the years after 1945. We have a lot of work to do, because when I entered politics, the center right was much more enthusiastic about those arrangements than the center left was. That's what brought me into the center right. And now the center right is even less enthusiastic. Now the right, I should say, because there is no more center. The right is even less enthusiastic about them than the left. But these ideas never stop. One of the great writers about trade, Henry George in the 19th century, that said that the theory of protectionism teaches us to do to ourselves in peace what our enemies try to do to us in war. Right? When your enemies, they blockade your harbors, they interfere with the flow of goods and services. That's an act of aggression, and it makes you poorer. And your enemies understand that. And then people say, "Well, why don't we? If we do it to ourselves, maybe the result will be different." No, the result will be the same. So we have to keep pressing for a world that trades in freedom, and understand that China raises special problems, but we need to keep in mind that trade, collective security, that's normal. The question of how to make sure that China stays on a good path, and not prematurely to hasten the conflict with China if we can avoid it. Where they choose to start conflicts, how we meet that, that's a very particular problem. But it is a different problem from aluminum from Canada, and ball bearings from Germany, and financial services from Great Britain, and your friends in Japan wanting to buy the second biggest steel company in the United States that older people think is the biggest because its name is U.S. Steel, and they can't believe that a company called Nucor makes more steel than U.S. Steel, but it does.
Let's wrap up, David, by reflecting on your earlier comments about the extent to which Trump has come to impose his dominance on the Republican Party since 2016. And my question about coalitional politics in the UK. If our listeners and viewers subscribe to the vision that you just articulated, and I think they indeed do, that's reflected in the number of downloads and views that we have for our conversations every couple of weeks. What's the path forward? How does one go about reconstructing a coalition in favor of that vision of open trade and free markets and personal responsibility and all of the rest that really has defined not just the Western world, but conservatism for most of your life, and indeed most of mine?
I think the way I think about this, it's a mantra I've been using again all my political life. The voters are always right about the problems. It's not their job to find the solutions. The job in a democracy, the parties compete, elites compete to provide solutions to problems that voters identify. So if there is disenchantment with the way the benefits of a free economy are spreading, that's something, yeah, you have to take that seriously. If people feel this globalized world is moving too fast, it's too different, I'm hearing too many foreign languages in the streets, that you give a hearing to the problem. And when they say, and my solution to it is that Britain should stop trading so much with France. You think, okay, that's not a good idea. That's not a good idea. It should be harder for my parents who have sunk all their savings into real estate in Spain to get to and from Spain. That's not a good idea. But I hear what you're saying about what you're unhappy about. So I think the message from the so-called populists, whatever we call this movement, is they've identified things that are real concerns, from immigration to what's happening to the price of real estate in relationship to incomes, to the pace of change, to the disabling effects of the internet, to the breakdown in relations between men and women. These are all things that need to be heard and need to be addressed. But responsible seekers of political office don't say, okay, in that case, let's just turn to whatever some loudmouth on cable TV identifies as the answer, because they're wrong. You shouldn't be afraid to say it is not going to help anything that anyone in the north of England cares about if we stop trading so much with France or make it more difficult for your grandparents to get to their house in Spain.
I said that was my final question, but if I can just sneak one more in, and let me preface it by saying you yourself have been arguing for politicians on both the left and the right to be responsive to those public impulses and public demands for some time. We've talked, for instance, about your book Comeback, which in a lot of ways anticipated the consequences if policymakers weren't responsive to what the public was telling them on some of the issues you just outlined. But it kind of brings me back to my question concerning the culpability of those who failed to be responsive. I mean, if you think about the period from 2008 to 2016, or whatever the time frame you choose, it seems to me it's a period in which, in hindsight, people failed to reckon with what you were telling them, warning them about. And in a way, the consequences, we got Trump. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify, but what happened? What caused the break between the public's transmission of its concerns and the political class's responsiveness to those concerns? What lessons should we learn from that period?
Well, that is a huge question, and in our last few minutes, I don't know that I can do justice to all of it. Let me point to one example of how it happened. I think in 1964, if there had been some epidemic that swept through the rural America and hit hard the young people there, everybody would feel it. People would be more closely connected to one another. But when the opioid epidemic swept through rural America, it was very possible for people in the wealthy and globalized cities not even to be aware of it. And in the book I wrote about Trump, I compared the number of mentions. I went through the New York Times index for the year 2016 and counted the number of mentions of the word opioid and the number of mentions of the word transgender. And I don't want to diminish any issue that anybody has got, but I mean, I'm not going to forget, but it was like 100 to 1 that opioids barely existed and the transgender issue was just overwhelmingly present. Well, that's not how it felt in Ohio. It took a long, and the death toll began to mount until it became so horrible that it could not be ignored. And Donald Trump in 2016, although obviously he had no idea, and the opioid problem became worse in every year of his presidency, except 2019, it got worse and worse. But he at least would talk. In 2016, he used the word opioids again and again in his speeches, especially when he was campaigning in places like New Hampshire and Ohio that had suffered so much. And it was very much invisible to the Hillary Clinton campaign. So we're just too far apart. So it's a spiral. As we become more disassociated from one another, problems become less visible to those who are having a better time of it. And they can then be more callous about what is happening to their fellow citizens. And that we just need more. So the solution to the problem is also the way you get to the solution. More connectivity, a stronger sense of shared citizenship. That will make you more alert to what is going on for those who are doing less well. And by the way, is also a way of helping those who are doing less well.
Yeah, what a thoughtful way to wrap up our conversation. David, I want to thank you for joining me, and I look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.
Thank you so much. Have a good summer. Bye-bye.